I discovered Brady a few years ago. As I got more into cardio, I wanted to learn from experienced subject matter expert people. Found this guy on X, actually. Got his books. An incredibly good teacher, has a master's in, I believe, exercise physiology. So, yeah, very well educated. Obviously has proof of outcome. He also has a podcast. He's based in Austin. I've been devouring all this stuff. But he's going to be talking about cardiovascular training. So, without further adu. Oh, you can clap.
Cool. All right, thanks, Alexander. Thanks, Alex, for putting this on. Yeah, I think just, before I get started, the whole golden age idea, I really do think that we are kind of in a golden age of health, especially being in Austin, Texas. You really get to see it. But, we have runners such as myself kind of getting into strength training. As you can see, I still have a lot of progress to make in that area. But then we have people, weightlifters, getting into cardio. Alexander reached out to me and we were talking about topics that I could talk about today, and he said, why don't you talk about cardio and demystifying zones? And so I think, if I turn Alexander into a runner by the end of this talk, I'll have accomplished my goal. Hopefully I can convince maybe some of you to get more interested in your cardiovascular health, and we're going to talk about why that is important today, and maybe some strategies to improve it that don't involve complex metrics like blood lactate and things like that. So, without further ado, here's my talk. Again, Brady Holmer. I have a master's degree in human performance, undergrad degree in exercise science. So I've been kind of studying this stuff for a long time, and hopefully that's not reflected too much in my talk, or in my slides at least, which can be a bit academic, but I think you'll learn a lot today. Disclaimer, I run, so I have a natural conflict of interest in all of this stuff. When I talk about exercise, I think everybody should be a runner or at least do some cardiovascular training. So for part one, we're going to talk about aerobic fitness, why it is the fountain of youth. Who here has heard of VO2 max? Okay, awesome. Has anybody here actually had a VO2 max test where you put on one of those cool little masks like Lance Armstrong? Okay, cool. A few people. If you don't, maybe something you will want to look into after I talk to you today. So VO2 max, you've all heard of it, but what is it and why does it matter? So VO2 max is a measure of your body's maximal rate of oxygen consumption. It's basically your capacity to take in oxygen, air, from the environment and turn it into energy in your body. Adenosine triphosphate, ATP. We've kind of all heard of ATP, probably learned about it in 3rd or 4th grade as being the energy currency of the cell. So your VO2 max represents your ability to turn oxygen into energy during exercise, but also at rest. We're producing energy all the time. It's new in the health space. It's probably come into the popular media in the past few years, thanks Dr. Peter Attia. But it's really not a new concept. Actually, it just celebrated its 100th birthday, so it's been known for about 100 years that this limit to maximal oxygen consumption exists. So you take a few people, kind of shown in this graph. This is the discovery of VO2 max, but you put them on a treadmill, you make them run faster and faster and faster, their oxygen consumption will go up. But eventually, there reaches a point where your body can't physically produce energy aerobically with oxygen anymore, and that is your VO2 max. So your oxygen plateaus despite running harder. So if you've done a VO2 max test or seen somebody do one, they basically reach a point where, I can't do this anymore. I jump off the treadmill. That's your VO2 max. But it's not just a number. Well, it is a number. Everybody has a VO2 max. If you do a test, you'll get a score, I guess we could call it, which is your rate of maximal oxygen consumption. But it reflects physiology. It reflects the integrative ability of your body to take in oxygen with your lungs, your heart, and your blood vessels to distribute the oxygen throughout your body, your blood vessels and your capillaries to deliver that oxygen to your mitochondria, and your mitochondria to take that oxygen and produce energy. So it's not just a number, it literally reflects the ability of your body to integrate all these systems to produce energy. And in my opinion, maybe not an opinion, but at least an opinion that's supported, but that's why I think it has this strong correlation, which we'll see in a second, with longevity and with health span. Because it's not just your, say, grip strength maybe, which is also correlated with longevity, but kind of just reflects your ability to squeeze really hard or something like that. You can't game a VO2 max test. You cannot, if you go in to test your blood glucose, say, you could fast to get it lower, or you could eat a low carb diet for a week. you'll get a lower blood glucose level. You can't fool a VO2 max test. It reflects your fitness, and it's going to be the same or nearly the same from day to day. If you're fit, it'll be high. If you're not fit, it'll be low. So you can't game it, and therefore it really reflects the health of your entire body. And again, this is why I think that there's such a strong relationship of VO2 max with longevity. It's stronger than some of the traditional cardiovascular disease risk factors. It predicts longevity better than body mass index, blood glucose, body fat percentage, even smoking. There are studies showing that people who smoke, if they have a high VO2 max, they have better longevity than people with a low VO2 max who don't smoke. So for those of you out there who smoke cigarettes, at least just make sure you do your cardiovascular training and you'll be fine. No, just kidding. That's not an endorsement, but it just goes kind of to show the power of fitness in perhaps mitigating some of the effects of negative lifestyle on health. There are several studies showing, if you increase your VO2 max by just one metabolic equivalent, or MET, so that's 3.5 mLs per kg per minute, it reduces your risk for all-cause mortality by 11%. And people who are in the top 1/3 of aerobic fitness have a nearly 45% lower all-cause mortality than people in the lower 1/3 of aerobic fitness. One of my favorite kind of studies on this, one of my favorite graphs is this one right here, basically showing that there's sort of this dose-dependent reduction in your mortality risk the fitter you are. So the elite category in this study, they had the lowest risk, and as you can see, the people who are, well below that and the low VO2 max had the highest risk of all-cause mortality. Some caveats with that study aside, it somewhat shows that there's not really an upper limit. So the fitter that you can get, the healthier that you will be, is kind of the conclusion of that. Unfortunately, like many things, including muscle mass, fitness, or VO2 max or cardiovascular fitness, it fades with age. Around age 30, where I am kind of at right now, is where your VO2 max peaks. So most people will reach their highest VO2 max at age 30. That assumes you were doing training up until then. There are people who start aerobic exercise training later in life. Obviously, then your VO2 max would peak a little bit later than that. But around then, age 30 to 50, VO2 max starts to decline, about 10% or so per decade. And then after you get to the 6th, 7th, 8th decade of life, the rate of your VO2 max decline accelerates. So it goes, starts to decline about 20 to 30% or more per decade. Now, of course, this isn't just some programmed biological phenomenon. Obviously, as most people get older, they start to exercise less. They become more frail. They lose muscle mass. All of those things are going to result in a lower VO2 max. But this is just to say that, the older you get, if you are not taking steps to improve your cardiovascular fitness, it will decline. Another kind of startling statistic and kind of unfortunate is that even among people who continue to exercise, endurance-trained men and women, VO2 max still declines at around the same rate as people who don't even exercise. So another kind of one of my favorite classic graphs, we have the endurance-trained people, the active people who are kind of your recreationally active participants, and then the sedentary folk. As you can see, they're kind of declining linearly at the same rate as they get older. But of course, the endurance-trained group, they're starting at a higher baseline VO2 max. So at any age, at age 20, 30, 40, 50, their VO2 max is going to be higher than that of the sedentary people. So sure, they're declining at the same rate, but they start at a higher level. We can kind of draw an analogy with muscle mass here. If you build up your muscles as much as you can until, say, age 40, and then they start to decline, well, you're going to hold on a lot longer. You're going to become frail at a later age because you just have more muscle in your kind of bank account of muscle. But why does VO2 max decline with age? So here's where I'll try to not dive too deep into physiology, but I think it does require a little bit of background, and it's kind of interesting, I think. So the components of VO2 max, or a equation that can be used to describe VO2 max, is known as the Fick equation. Basically, it is cardiac output, how much blood your heart can pump out to the rest of your body, multiplied by the AVO2 difference, which basically is the arterial, so blood in your arteries goes from the heart, and venous, that's the blood that comes back to your heart. The difference between that is how much oxygen your muscles are pulling out of the blood. So how much blood your body can pump out how much the oxygen takes up. That's your VO2, that's your oxygen consumption. And so the components of that Fick equation, each of those components decline with age. And we'll get to kind of practically why this matters in a little bit, but your cardiac output goes down with age. That basically just means your heart pumps less blood with each beat. And that is due to a decline in your maximal heart rate, declines, it drops about 1 beat per year, and stroke volume, it also declines. Your heart muscles physically become weaker, and so they can't contract as hard. They can't push as much blood out when they beat. So your cardiac output and your stroke volume decline, and your heart rate decline. So your heart, it becomes stiffer, less elastic. Obviously, that can be prevented with things like exercise training, but your heart can't generate as much force. You just physically cannot pump as much blood. You also experience a decline in mitochondrial quality and mitochondrial number, and get fewer capillaries. Capillaries are the very thin, tiny blood vessels that are where oxygen diffuses out into the mitochondria. You get less dense capillaries with age. This reduces our body's ability to distribute oxygen and get it from the muscles into the mitochondria, where eventually it is turned into energy, or ATP. All of this is to say that because these components decline, and because they ultimately result in the decline in aerobic fitness, or your VO2 max, this is stressing the importance of building what we'll call a fitness investment account, fitness bank account. Lots of economic themes here today relating to fitness, which is kind of cool. There have been kind of some studies showing, but just in general, it's been shown that a VO2 max of around 15 is associated with functional dependence. So if you drop below this frailty threshold, what we'll call it, basically it becomes harder to perform activities of daily living. Somebody who has a VO2 max of 15, they're gonna have a hard time walking upstairs, carrying groceries. And so the implications of this for aging, you want to sort of stay above that frailty threshold for as long as you can. And that means building up that higher baseline, as well as kind of mitigating that decline. So you can see here, we have somebody who is training in the thick black line, somebody who's sedentary in the thin black line. When they reach about age 80, the sedentary person drops below that threshold. So they're essentially going to become frail. Doing things generally is just going to become harder. The trained person, well, they don't really reach that frailty threshold until around age 95. So they may never reach it. If they don't live to be 95, they're never going to reach that frailty threshold. So they're going to have an entire life of functional independence versus functional dependence because they fell below that frailty threshold. Looking at this graph, I like to kind of use, Peter Attia uses a nice kind of strategy, what he calls back casting. So think about, what do you want to have a VO2 max of when you're 100 years old? Say you want it to be 20. Okay, well, just work back from that then. What do I need to have a VO2 max now at age 40 to never reach 20 at age 100? And that will kind of inform you, how do I need to train now to reach that VO2 max, assuming, say, the 10% decline per decade. We're not going to go through all that math now. We'll ask for Alex's help for that later. He's the math whiz here. So VO2 max, how do we train it? What are we going to do then to mitigate that decline, or at least prevent the steep decline that occurs with aging? Well, aerobic exercise, or what we'll refer to as cardio. I kind of have a vendetta against that word, but I'll use it today just for the sake of the talk. Cardio is the best way to improve your cardio. Big revelation today. But now, what is the optimal protocol? So who here has heard of zone 2 training? Okay, awesome. That's a good thing and a bad thing, I think. So in the last few decades, again, like VO2 max, zone 2 training has, or I say decades, the last probably 5 years maybe, zone 2 training has become very popular, but it's not new. Runners and endurance athletes typically refer to this as just steady state or long, slow distance, base cardio, whatever you want to call it. But it's gotten a name, zone 2 training, and unfortunately that's come with kind of a lot of confusion, a lot of complexity. If I ask anybody on the street, maybe define zone 2 training, I might get 100 different answers depending on who I ask. So what we're going to do in part 2 of the talk today is sort of demystify training zones. I'll talk about, if you want to do cardiovascular training and enhance maybe your cardiovascular fitness, there are several ways to train, and maybe you've heard of training zones, and obviously everybody here has heard of one of the zones, zone 2 training, but what does that actually mean? Does it matter if you're training in zone 2 or if you call what you're doing zone 2 training? What I'm going to conclude today is not really, and we're going to try to simplify cardiovascular training a little bit. And the reason why I think, training zones are useful for endurance athletes and coaches and even the general public who just wants to do general training, they can provide a specific prescription, but they're complex and very ambiguous. So we can define them using heart rate percentages, or lactate thresholds, or VO2 percentages, or a 5-zone model, or a 7-zone model. It's very easy to kind of get lost in the nuances of these different training zones and really understand, what am I training? What are my goals? What zone do I need to train in to accomplish those goals? There are several ways, again, to define all of these zones. So this is just one example. I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but as you can just see, there are different rating of perceived exertion scales that we can use to define zones 1 through 5. We can use verbal or subjective anchors. Oh, this feels easy. This is comfortable. This is demanding. We could use percent heart rate, percent of maximal heart rate. We can use breathing, or so-called the talk test. Can you speak in full sentences? Are you gasping for air? And then we can measure, very specific physiological biomarkers like blood lactate. These are all different ways to define zones, and none of them are wrong. But if we just choose one zone, for example, to use zone 2 as an example, since it's kind of the most popular zone that people will probably heard of, we have 5, 6, 7 different ways to define zone 2. So if we're using a 20-point scale, zone 2 is going to be a 9 to 12. If we're using a 10-point scale, it's a 2 to 3. If we were to subjectively describe somebody training in zone 2, it's described as comfortable. Well, okay, that might be what I think is comfortable, might be different from someone else. It's typically also defined with a talk test. You're supposed to be able to hold a conversation. If you can talk with your training partner, then you're probably in zone 2. 67 to 82% of maximal heart rate, 1 to 2 millimolar of blood lactate. So as you can see, if I were to prescribe someone, you need to go out and do 30 minutes of cardio in zone 2. Well, how do you want me to define this? It should just be comfortable. Okay, well, that comfort level, it may not align with all of those other indicators of the zone 2. So there may, but there also may not be a lot of overlap between these different ways to define zone 2. And nobody can really agree on a consensus definition of what zone 2 training even means. So what actually really matters? I would maybe like to convince you today that, yes, if you want to do zone 2 and take blood lactate measurements during exercise, you can do that. I think that's fun. I've done it before. But what really matters if we want to improve our fitness? Are we training easy? Are we having easy days when we need to go easy? Are we doing the fundamental easy training that will build our kind of aerobic base and develop our aerobic metabolism? Are we training hard occasionally? Are we doing high-intensity interval training maybe once a week? That's important. I think everybody should elevate their heart rate at least probably once per week, twice per week maybe if it suits you. And then are you spending some time at higher intensities that are going to help develop your VO2 max? There are really few things that matter, these 3 things, when you're doing cardiovascular training. Not what your blood lactate is and if you're at 87.5% of your maximal heart rate. So we don't need to measure zones perfectly if we want to improve our fitness, no matter our goal. If we want to improve our power output, our VO2 max, or just kind of improve our mitochondrial health. You don't really need these specific measurements. Again, although you can use them if you want to. Reason number 1, the body adapts to effort, not percentages. So a 4-minute interval, if you're at 87% of your maximal heart rate or 90% of your maximal heart rate, they're fundamentally the same. The body doesn't have some sensor that knows whether you're at 87% or 88%, and it knows how to adapt based on that percentage. It adapts to effort. In zones, they represent more of a spectrum than a threshold. Again, I think when people kind of hear like this zone 2, or maybe, there's fat burning exercise and then there's carb burning exercise, this makes it seem like there's a switch where, if I just run a little bit faster, I flip over from carbohydrate burning to fat burning. In reality, it's a spectrum. So you can see here, like as exercise intensity kind of increases, our carbohydrate burning in the purple line, it'll go up. As you run harder or ride a bike harder or whatever, you're gonna burn progressively more carbohydrate and progressively less fat, that red line right there. So it's a spectrum. There's not a point at which you just jump over from burning carbs to burning fat. Second, if you're using some type of technology when you go out and train, which most of us probably are, maybe you have a Whoop strap, maybe you have a Garmin, maybe you have an Apple Watch, it'll often tell you how much time you spent in the various zones. This is just a screenshot of a Whoop app, for example. These estimate zones, but the formulas are not perfect. And one reason for that is that most of them will use age-predicted maximal heart rate. Everybody's probably heard the equation of 220 minus your age. That should be what your maximal heart rate is. There are several flaws with that. It's an algorithm that was derived from a single study. And if you really were to measure most people's maximal heart rate, it's not going to be 220 minus age. And so without an accurate measurement of maximal heart rate, these zones that you're getting are not going to be accurate. So a lot of these devices do, and I would recommend you do that if you're interested in getting these accurate zone measurements, plugging in an actual maximal heart rate that you would have achieved during exercise versus relying on this formula which may or may not be accurate. I know plenty of 40 and 50-year-olds with a maximal heart rate of 200, which is 20, 30 beats per minute higher than that equation would predict. My maximal heart rate's only 186. I'm 32 years old, so it's a little bit lower than what my age predicted would be. That's just one of the limitations of that. There are also several individual differences. So if we take, say, blood lactate, for example, if you're a trained endurance runner versus a novice who has not ever done much cardiovascular training, the blood lactate that corresponds to a zone 2 training might be higher for that endurance runner than it is for the recreational runner. Exercise modality in the equipment will matter. So if my zone 2 heart rate on a stationary bike might be different from what it is on a treadmill, for example. And then just general physiological differences between people make these blanket zone 2 or training zone prescriptions not really apply evenly among a lot of people. Another reason why these precise measurements aren't always the best is that the zone metrics will fluctuate. So there's day-to-day variability. All of us have probably experienced this. Day-to-day variability in heart rate, lactate, and effort levels. So if I go out and run the same pace, say this morning, and then go out and try to run the same pace tomorrow, my heart rate at that same pace might be different. Maybe I got less sleep. Maybe I stayed out too late at the after party of the Golden Age Health Summit. Maybe it's humid, 90% humidity tomorrow. That could be very well true in Austin, Texas, and it was less humid today. Something called cardiac drift happens if you're exercising in the heat and humidity. You can maintain your same effort, maybe not effort, but your same, say, pace or riding a bike at the same speed, but your heart rate gradually creeps up as you get dehydrated. So your effort's going to increase, your heart rate is going to increase, which might throw you out of something like a zone 2 heart rate, but you're maintaining the same pace. So how accurate is heart rate in that scenario? Again, the conditions will also matter. So if you're fed versus fasted, trying to do exercise, after you've eaten versus waking up in the morning having not eaten anything. If you're sleep deprived or well rested, the environmental factors like I just mentioned, heat and humidity, morning and the evening, all of these are going to impact your rating of perceived exertion, your heart rate, all of these physiological metrics. So if we just said my zone 2 is at this heart rate or this blood lactate, and we just assume that that is the same from day to day, from month to month, from year to year, that's not necessarily true because all of these things fluctuate. So the bottom line, the training zones are more dynamic than static, and I think often when we talk about these things, we want them to be or think that they are static. So how can we simplify zones? You can improve fitness, you can improve cardiovascular health without even measuring zones, without even thinking about zones. A 3, and I use 3 zone model here, so that's kind of a misnomer, but let's just think about training as easy, moderate, and hard. And why does it work? Well, it might sound kind of unscientific but if you really think about it, easy, moderate, and hard, those are subjective ratings. Those are effort ratings. Well, what do we use to gauge our effort during exercise? Well, our brain. And our brain is very good at integrating physiological signals. It's good at integrating our body temperature, our lactate levels, our heart rate, our tension in our muscles, and even how much like glycogen that we have stored in our muscles. It's very good at integrating those signals and giving us a subjective effort of how hard this feels. It's not just oh, I think this is easy. If exercise feels easy, well, that's probably because your heart rate is kind of within a range. You're not overly heated, you're not dehydrated. So it is actually, I think, rating of perceived exertion is almost one of the more scientific ways to measure how hard you're training and your training zones. So, zone 1, easy zone. I'll try to stop saying zones, but it's hard now. Easy zone. So this is your foundational training. This is where you're going to build your aerobic base, increase your capillarization, increase your mitochondrial health. 60 minutes to 2 hours or more, just your long, easy kind of weekend bike ride or your long, easy weekend hike or your ruck. Everybody in Austin likes to ruck with a weight vest. So go around and walk around Ladybird Lake for a couple hours. That's your easy zone. How to measure it? I use heart rate here. Heart rate is useful, but if you can hold a conversation without a lot of effort, and if it feels easy, it probably is. So do a lot of easy training every week. There shouldn't really be kind of a limit placed on that. I would say do as much easy zone training as you can. The moderate zone, this is kind of where you build your strength and your resilience. You can think of this as being a threshold effort. Runners, we sometimes use tempo run to kind of describe this effort. Benefits of this, it boosts your power output, your metabolic efficiency, also kind of the zone where fat burning is probably maximized, and you'll improve your lactate clearance capacity if that's something you're concerned about. That's, concerned with performance. If you're running a 5K or something, you might be interested in improving your lactate clearance capacity. The moderate zone, talking gets harder. Again, you could hold a conversation, but you'd probably be somewhat gasping in this zone. And so subjectively, it's not going to be comfortable, but you could continue it for probably 20 to 30 minutes, but it's certainly not the hardest you can go. And then we have a hard zone. So this is where you push your limits. Short, intense intervals, high intensity interval training, HIIT, everybody's heard of that. This would kind of be that hard zone. You want to do it once or twice a week. It's going to be 10 to 30 minutes. You don't want to do this too much, or you could burn out or overtrain. I put those in quotes because nobody can agree on what the heck that is, or even if they exist. But this is where you're going to elevate your ceiling. This is where you're going to elevate your VO2 max, increase your peak power output, increase your sprint speed. And how to measure this? You're going to be close to 100% or 85 to 100% of your max heart rate. And if you're talking, you're doing it wrong. You should not be able to talk during the hard zone training. So again, this is like your high intensity interval training. I didn't prescribe, numbers on any of these. How much should you do per week? Should you do 80% low intensity, 20% high intensity? That's a, talk in and of itself. And I think everybody needs to kind of individualize these zones. But I think the key here is that, do a lot of easy training during the week, integrate some moderate training, and then do hard training once or twice a week. And if you can do that, you will improve your cardiovascular fitness, you will improve your VO2 max, you will improve your overall health. And it doesn't really have to be complicated. I as much as anyone like measuring things. I love measuring my heart rate and looking at my data after a run. But in reality, if you're doing some easy training and some hard training, you're going to improve your health and your fitness. So it isn't easy. It does require effort, but it can be simple. So where you can find me, I'm on X at B_Holmer. You can follow me there. I'm kind of more active there. I do have an Instagram, Brady J. Holmer. I don't post much on there. I'm trying to be a little bit better about that. And then I also write a weekly newsletter on Substack, Physiologically Speaking. I chose a very easy name to spell and remember there. But that's the domain you can go to. I send out a newsletter every Friday. It's called Physiology Friday. I break down some studies, talk about science. I occasionally post more than once a week, but just science-related content on there. I also have a book. It's called VO2 Max Essentials, talking about a lot of what I talked about today, VO2 Max, its association with longevity, association with health, but then a lot of other science in there on how to improve it, how it's affected by age, and hopefully a version 2 will come out of that soon when I can find the time to write it. But If you scan that QR code, that'll take you to Amazon. You can buy ebook, hardcover, paperback, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, if you don't have it already, hope you get it and enjoy it. And that's all for me.